Welcome. I'm here with Michael Plekon, noted author, priest, and friend. And today we're going to be talking about his book, which is coming out very shortly, called Ministry Matters. And Michael, you like to say a lot with the titles to your books. Your last one was Community is Church, Church is Community, the tautology, the back and forth. And Ministry Matters really kind of has a double meaning, doesn't it?
It sure does. I decided that since I talked about clergy in the first book, that is to say, the people who are ordained to serve as pastors in the church, I could only say so much, but therefore, to give a book to the clergy in themselves was my aim in Ministry Matters. And by the title, I meant to say that ministry has a lot of issues today, but that ministry is still essential. It's important to the life of the church.
Well, that's one meaning.
Mm-hmm.
The other meaning is that your book talks about matters that relate to the ministry
Correct.
and things that ministers do. So it has a bit of a double meaning.
Yeah.
And we've talked a little bit also about the fact that your book is not just for ministers.
Correct. This is a book for everybody, because underlying my view of, and I think it's the view that most Christian writers have had from the beginning, is that the church is a community. We refer to the church as the people of God, the body of Christ. Clergy, bishops, priests, deacons are not a special caste or a group in the church, but in fact they are part of the church. Nicholas Afanasieff, who I cite again in this book, argues that in the first 3 centuries, every church community, every local congregation or church selected leaders from within that church. Today we don't do it quite that way, although there's some aspects of it.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah.
But on a broad overview, the book is structured as a series of conversations largely through the writings of other pastors.
That's right. I have slightly over a dozen people that over the years I have read with great profit, who I believe are worth listening to. So I listen to them. There are people like Barbara Brown Taylor, Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Francis, among others. And I think what they have to say to us is not how to be the leader of a congregation, but rather what are the things that are involved in being the leader of a congregation.
Okay. And the selection of people that you talk about is interesting because you have a broad spectrum of people from fairly conservative theologians to basically some rebels.
Mm-hmm. I think what I tried to aim at is first and foremost an ecumenical selection. I didn't want to keep it restricted to one tradition or one denomination. That would make no sense. I also tried to pick from people who came from various backgrounds. So we have professional academic theologians like Sarah Coakley and Rowan Williams and Will Willimon from the Methodist tradition. But we also have parish pastors such as George Keith, who is a retired priest but a member of the parish here, and even people who never really were leaders of parishes, but who are chaplains like Henry Nouwen.
You've published a number of books, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yes, I have. I've published a lot of books about ordinary people who live lives of extraordinary holiness, who probably will never be canonized by the church. But none of the books are recipe books. They're not how-to-do-it books, and this one is not one of those either.
Okay, but the point I want to get to with this book is that although this book is specifically addressed to ministers and pastors, it doesn't come out of the blue. It grows or builds on your prior works.
Exactly. I think it really is a pair up with Community as Church, Church as Community. It would be very helpful to read that and then read this one. You could read either one of them on its own. It would still be intelligible, but the two of them make sense together.
Okay. And the difference being, at least in my mind when I read through it, is that Community as Church, it has more I'll say, practical stories of things that churches have done. And Ministry Matters is more guidance for the pastors who are doing some of these things.
I would say so. In community as church, church as community, I did pay attention to a number of studies about well-being and satisfaction, also attrition, things that are measures of how pastors live their lives, how they work out their vocations in congregations. There's not much of that in this book. This book is more about what I would call the meat and potatoes, what it is that you do day after day after day. George Keith says it really well. He says a priest or a pastor is someone who connects people to God and connects God to people.
I believe the quote is, he brings God to the people and the people to God. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And if last time we had lunch, I think you told me a story that George gave you the written script for the sermon where that came from, and that line was nowhere in the written script.
That's right. George is a real crafter of sermons. He was an actor and taught drama and has directed plays for most of his life. He's in his 80s now. And one of the things that George did after he gave me the manuscript is he said, I don't know how you want to use this, but if you find that it's not up to snuff, you can just disregard it, discard it. And I was looking for that one line, and I emailed him back and I said, George, the best line in that sermon is not in the text. And George's comment was, well, I must have been inspired.
Or sometimes I just do that.
That's right. That's right.
Sometimes we just go off script, and sometimes the off script moments are the ones that we remember.
Yes, and at the very end of the book, like I did in the previous book, I use a little bit of my own experience, because what really moves me is not just the words, very articulate and erudite words of the people that I listen to here, but also things that I saw. And I've seen priests interact with people. I've seen them sit on a bench and just listen when somebody's pouring out their heart and soul. That's what this book is about. This book is about the real flesh and blood of being part of the people of God, but also being a shepherd, a pastor.
Okay, and my border collies like the shepherd, and they're particular fans of Pope Francis because he uses the shepherd analogy big time.
Does.
So,
he does.
And trust me, my border collies know what sheep smell like.
Yes, Pope Francis, what you're referring to is, I think, probably what will go down in history as Pope Francis's greatest line about pastors, that they had better smell like the sheep. If they don't, there's something seriously wrong.
And as one who works with sheep and does some shepherding, I understand that to mean that you need to get in amongst the flock and be a part of them so that their smell rubs off on you and so that you recognize them.
Yeah, my first boss, my first rector, senior pastor, told me that it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years for a community to get to know and trust its pastor, and vice versa. And I think that tells you something about the real core of the relationship. It is, well, some would call it a marriage, but I think just saying that it is a close connection. You can't have one without the other. You can't have the flock without the shepherd. You can't have, what's the point of a shepherd without the flock?
Agreed. I want to go back to the selection of the various people in the book. And by the very nature, it is published pastors heavy, just because those are the people that are accessible and that you can get access to their works.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, not that all of these people in the book have had books or articles come out. Some of them are more known for their blogs, like Nadia Bolz-Weber, a quite controversial and much read Lutheran pastor. Also Kathy Caimano, who calls herself a free-range priest. She is a part-time pastor to a parish in North Carolina, but she does a lot of online blogging and a lot of consulting, both to parishes as well as the clergy.
But the point I want to get to is that although most of the people who are featured in the book are well known either through their public activities or through their published writings, you chose to lead off with the parish pastor, George Keith, who is probably known to far less, but certainly is a great pastor.
Yeah, because I think I got to know George over the course of a number of years, almost a decade or more now. And I could watch George doing things that said to me, this is really a pastor. Didn't have his collar on, didn't have his vestments on. In many cases, he was involved with the community theater or maybe on the fringe of a food bank here. But I saw him listening to people and interacting with people. When he does have his vestments on, just like Father David, who's the pastor here, he's greeting everybody as they come into church and greeting everybody as they go out of church. Now, we also, in the middle of the liturgy, do the sharing of the peace, and so he greets all those people yet another time. What does that tell you about his sense of ministry? That ministry is in that extending of the hand and wishing a person well and welcoming a person.
And you talk about the role of the pastor, and you use Nicholas Afanasieff to go back to how the role of the pastor goes back to the beginnings of the church. And the pastor is a part of the community, but not apart from the community.
Father Nicholas Afanasieff is not known outside scholarly circles, although he was one of the few Orthodox scholars invited to the Second Vatican Council as an expert. And his own findings and point of view got brought over here to the States through one of his students, Alexander Schmemann, who became the dean of St. Vladimir's Seminary and became probably the most known Orthodox liturgical theologian. Afanasieff was himself, though, when he had the chance during the Second World War in Tunisia, an absolutely splendid parish pastor. He baked his own bread for communion. He welcomed everybody into his church when they were short on food, whether they were Muslim, non-believers, Catholics, Protestants. You didn't have to be Orthodox to get tea.
Okay. He also has a theory, as expressed in your book, that the pastor is simply the one of the flock that is chosen to preside.
Yeah. And that's the way he lived. But as a scholar, he went back and looked at the earliest documents that we have and noticed that whether it was Ignatius of Antioch or Cyprian of Carthage or any of the other early Christian writers.
Let's go earlier and let's go to who Paul was addressing his letters to.
Paul was addressing his letters to actual congregations at Ephesus, at Corinth, at Thessaloniki. But also the Acts of the Apostles describe in great detail how 7 people were selected out of a congregation in Jerusalem to become the first deacons, the first ones to minister to those who were in need during the week. So it's all there. In fact, Afanasieff loves this phrase, they were all together in the same place at the same time. It's 3 tiny Greek words, but it says all of that.
Okay. And we go back, Dave Barnhart kind of goes back to those roots with his house churches.
Yeah, David Barnhart is a Methodist pastor in Alabama, and I featured him in Community as Church, Church as Community. What he has done is to revive house churches. Now, house churches got a revival back 30 or more years ago, in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But David got tired of planting churches. He told his bishop, I'm out of the white steeple business, and simply said to 7 or 8 people who had come and worshiped with him at his home, let's you all start churches in your houses and see where it goes. And that was over a dozen years ago. And St. Junia, it's named for the wife of a pair who were apostles and leaders of the church, Andronicus and Junia.
And just as an aside, that's particularly appropriate in this 50th anniversary year of the first ordination of women
That's
priests
correct.
in the Episcopal
That's
Church.
correct. Yes, Paul writes to these people, Andronicus and Unia, but also Lydia and Phoebe and others as my co-workers, meaning you do exactly what I do.
And there's a paradigm with the house church, as Dave Barnhart describes its growth, that is different than what the traditional white steepled church would be.
David Barnhart is also got a doctorate in New Testament exegesis and in homiletics, so he knows what he's talking about when it comes to the origins of Christian congregational life in the scriptures. And he says in his writings about the house churches, don't take this as a solution to shrinking congregations, buildings that are too massive and too costly to keep and repair. This is not the antidote or the medicine that's going to cure everything.
Okay. I'm looking to specifically, Dave talks about how when a house church reaches a certain critical mass, instead of just adding more seats at the table, it kind of goes like this. It splits into two house churches.
Yeah. Well, that's, you know, that when you have too many people invited to your house and you run out of chairs.
They're kind of like an amoeba.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing he points out is that when you have a house church of, say, anywhere from 6 to maybe even a dozen members, everyone counts. You can't just decide to take a Sunday off because you really will be missed. Now, that's not to exaggerate. Of course, you could take a Sunday off. You may have to go to a wedding or a funeral or a vacation or something like that. But his point is that it's okay to be small congregations today. Those of us who have experienced small congregations know that when you say to somebody, well, you know, in the summertime we have a dozen people at best, they go, ooh, really? Well, that dozen people is still a community, and they talk to one another during the week.
And at the other end of the spectrum, we have Nadia, Boltz-Weber, who was installed as a public minister.
Correct. After running a church which she called All Saints and All Sinners in Denver, an ecumenical community, but it was under the auspices of the ELCA Synod or diocese there. She decided it was time for her to move on, and the bishop of that synod decided that she could be a public minister or a public pastor, which is what she does. So on ordinary Sunday, she moves around from the Episcopal Cathedral to the Lutheran Cathedral to the Presbyterian, biggest church there, to the Methodist and so forth. Everybody welcomes her. She, interestingly enough, dresses in the vestments that are appropriate to each of those. She has changed what she does a little bit.
She may have softened her edges because, as described, not everybody always welcomed her.
That's right. All Saints and All Sinners was really a congregation of people who understood themselves to be marginal and maybe liked being marginal almost too much.
Okay.
And sometimes I found that her writings got her into a corner where she could no longer really deal on a Sunday morning with somebody who was not as edgy and marginal as she was or her people.
But in contrast to Dave Barnhart, who was working with the small groups, she is deliberately working with a large group and going from one large group to another.
Yeah, and I think that you could say that about a number of the other people who I listen to here. Barbara Brown Taylor is a good example of that. She, for years, has been a best-selling author, not just for her collections of sermons, but also for several strings or threads of books that she's published.
I found it interesting, the story that you told in the book, that at the, I don't know if it was an ordination, but basically the designation of Nadia Boltz-Weber as a public minister, the Lutheran bishop compared her to another very different public minister, Fred Rogers.
Yeah, but it was apt. Even though if you looked at Nadia Boltz-Weber, who's heavily tattooed on her arms, you would say, what does she have in that unites her or makes her look like Fred Rogers, who, by the way, was an ordained Presbyterian pastor. What she does is she is able to relate way beyond the moment. Fred Rogers was able to do that. Not only was his show aimed particularly at children, I mean, he tried to speak in a way that was accessible to them, but he knew that their parents were listening. So it was not just for children, it was for the whole family, or if you might say, society or world in which they live.
If I can bring it full circle to community, if you remember, Fred Rogers' key phrase was, "Won't you be my neighbor?"
Won't you be my neighbor? And nowadays, in a society, in a country that's so divided in politics, in culture, in economics and finances, there isn't a better thing for us to take out of the heart of our faith than that. In these Sundays after Easter right now, we keep hearing from the letters of John and from the Gospel of John about how God is love, and that if we abide in God and abide in love, that's it. That is the message that Christ came to bring to the earth.
I want to go back, switch gears here a little bit, to how pastors get selected.
Mm-hmm.
And that varies from denomination to denomination.
Mm-hmm.
Some, like Roman Catholics, for example, the bishop will send a priest to a parish and gosh, you better make it work somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And other denominations will go out and find their own, and then there are hybrids.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them, once they show up, they need to become part of the community, is your theory.
Yeah, I follow what my first rector said. No matter how good your process has been of trying to identify someone who you think would be good as the pastor of your community, and vice versa. Am I the right person for this community as a pastor? Despite all of that, you still need time. You need to celebrate the great feast days, Lent and Advent too. You need to go through deaths and people aging and getting weak and sick. You need to go through the joys. You need to go through celebrating the 50th anniversary of the parish, as we're going to do here. You need all that, and it takes time. So there's no replacement for it. I wouldn't, and I don't think Hank Mertens would say it has to be within 3 to 5 years, but it does take time.
But you need to date, you need to be engaged,
Yeah.
and then have a fully functional marriage.
Just as with a friendship, just as with someone you fall in love with and build a life with. Yeah, exactly.
Geraldine Granger. You know who she is.
Mm-hmm.
A prime example of a vicar being imposed fictionally, of
Mm-hmm.
course, but the vicar is imposed by the bishop on a community which, if you remember the first episode, they're literally at the vestry meeting saying, "Oh my gosh, I hope the bishop doesn't send us a woman."
This is Vicar of Dilby. He's talking
Vicar
about.
of Dibley.
Yeah.
And of course, it's the wonderful comedian Don French,
Mm-hmm.
who shows up and over the course of the series clearly becomes a part of the community.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's one of the best things that's ever been produced about a priest in a parish. There is another one, a more serious one, called Rev. But this is a beautiful one. It's hilarious. The vestry of that Dibley parish is really quite an ensemble of master comedians. But what they face in the actual ongoing series, I think it ran about 6, 7, 8 years or seasons.
Actually, Don French even did some updated YouTube videos during the pandemic.
That's correct.
And
speaking as the Vicar of Dibley.
No, she'd made it to bishop by then.
Yeah. Oh, she did. Yeah.
But yeah, there's one episode in particular which I think shows the community and how the community cares for each other in that. And I'm not sure if you remember the Easter Bunny episode.
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
I'll refresh your memory. The elderly woman member of the vestry who makes these incredibly weird culinary concoctions has apparently been every year going out as the Easter Bunny. And she is ill, and she calls each of the other members of the vestry in and asks them each to help her out. And so you have 7 Easter bunnies roaming around Dibley, none of them knowing about each other, but all of them trying to help out because they wanted to step up and showing the love for each other.
And that becomes a parable. The pastor is not there to do everything. Sometimes I've heard it said that when you're ordained, you should be given a toilet brush and a plumber's wrench and a scrub brush and all the other things that a janitor or somebody who is the super of a building might have. But the priest or the pastor is not there to do everything. The priest or the pastor is there to lift up and to show everybody that there's a vocation to be a minister. In many places where there's a ministers' association, that title is understood to be everybody, laity as well as clergy, because everybody by their baptism, it says that whenever we renew our baptismal promises, everybody is there to proclaim the good news. Everybody there is to heal, to reconcile, to forgive, to show mercy, to give assistance.
Yeah, I have a friend that I went to high school with more years ago than we will admit to, who's been a Catholic priest for more years than I can admit to because it would give away my age. But I did talk to him about a year ago, and he said something that I think you agree with and that is very wise, that he became effective when he learned to do less.
Yeah, Kathy Carmano says that. And she also says that there's a bunch of terms we ought to stop using. One of them I know that you like is outreach.
No, I don't like that term.
No, she said phrases.
I like her position on that. I don't like the term.
Well, right. But she says that's one of a number of things that seem innocent to us, but in fact give the wrong impression. And if we continue to go along with them, push us in the wrong direction. Sam Wells, one of the other people.
Yeah. Let me interrupt.
Yeah.
Because that's just sort of floating out there, and unless you explain why that gives a wrong impression or could give a wrong impression, people are going to miss that.
Kathy says, and this is the free-range priest, she's an Episcopal priest in North Carolina, she says something like outreach suggests that you should always be looking for more opportunities to be of assistance and service. Now, that doesn't sound bad, but it also sounds like you could be the Kiwanis or the Rotary or any other not-for-profit. And her point is about this is subtle, that if the people in a parish are members of the larger community, trust them to know where the need is.
Well, her point is actually even more subtle than that, in that words matter. And in this day, when we talk about people's pronouns, if we're using the with instead of
prepositions.
They're
prepositions.
No, but do people talk about pronouns? He, she.
Yeah.
And she's talking about using the proper preposition. And when we talk about outreach, the literal meaning of the word is that we are reaching out to somebody who is not part of us, who is not with us, which is, and I agree with her. That's why I don't like the word.
She's echoing Sam Wells, who taught for a number of years at Duke Divinity here in the States, but is back as the rector, the victor of St. Martin's in the Fields right down at Trafalgar Square in London. He's published a slew of books, and for him, prepositions are extremely important. And I will go right to the heart of it. He said, the preposition that counts in the gospel, that therefore should count with every priest or pastor, with every Christian, is with. We are always working with, not for. We are not reaching out to. We are not Lady Bountiful or Lord Bountiful, a kind of a noblesse oblige. We who have more should be sharing with you who have less. I've heard.
Just to explain, Lady Bountiful is a character from a novel in the 18th century who wanted to go out and do charity. So she thought of these wonderful charity projects and went out and did all these things that none of the people she was doing charity for actually wanted.
Right, right. They needed bread and soup, and she was
bringing them China,
right,
or something like that. But,
so that really gets down to the heart of the matter here, where we started. Right, it's all about community. The pastor is always part of that community. It doesn't make any difference if a bishop has sent a person there for a number of years, as in the Methodist tradition or the Catholic, or that the bishop has approved what, say, a Lutheran or a Presbyterian or an Episcopalian congregation has decided on the person that they think would be good. It doesn't make any difference. That is going to eventually be a good relationship, a good friendship, a good partnership, a good marriage, even if you want.
And let's talk about community. Community is non-denominational. It does not have a brand name.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't have a brand name because it's ecumenical. It's universal. It's if you want to find out about that and see all the references, go to community as church, church as community. You don't have to argue for it from any kind of document, which is a confession of faith, the 39 articles, or various church canons, or anything like that.
And originally the church was ecumenical. There was basically one church. Mm-hmm. And we got away from that for, at least 500 years or so from the Protestant Reformation, until we started to come back with the Vatican II under John XXIII.
Right. And I think that has remained. There are people who say we're in an ecumenical winter, that things have gotten frozen, that there's not much movement. But if you look more closely, I don't know that we have time to do this here, but there are more breakthroughs between church bodies now than there have been in the last 500 years.
Well, I think we live in an age where people expect instant results.
Yeah.
And people forget that the church, Christian church, has been around for 2,000 years.
That's right.
And things sometimes happen slowly, and we go through cycles, and hopefully we're going back to that cycle. I want to talk a bit about community, and I want to talk about a very aptly named ministry that our pastor here, Dave Madsen, runs, and he ran in his prior church, also called Welcome Ministry.
Yeah.
First of all, what a wonderful name.
Yeah. Well, if there's anything that you would take away from looking at the first local churches in the years after Jesus departed and ascended and the Holy Spirit came, this is in the Acts of the Apostles, they are centers of hospitality, whether they're in Jerusalem, whether they're in Antioch, whether they're later on further away in Cyprus, Thessalonica.
Or if they're in El Cajon, California.
Or in El Cajon, California, or Borrego Springs, California, or Temecula, California, or even San Diego, California. They're centers where if you come, you will be welcomed as a friend, no matter who you are, no matter what you look like, no matter how much money you have or don't have. And also, there are communities in which your politics and your lifestyle will not matter. In fact, people will bend over backwards to make sure that you feel you're a brother or a sister, even if they don't use those words.
You tell a story in the final chapter of your book about a parishioner who I will deliberately avoid getting into too many identifying factors, but who came to you and said, I try to avoid talking politics because I'm very conservative and this is not really a conservative congregation, and so I don't want to get people upset. And then you invited this person to help out with the parish food bank, and it seems to have been a bit of a transformative experience.
It was after listening to, I don't know, more than a half an hour of download about, people who don't need help, but keep going on and sort of looking for free help, whether it's food or clothing or other kind of entitlements. I said, well, I guess I shouldn't have invited you to volunteer at a food bank. And I got a call from this person the next morning saying, oh, I hope you will just delete that. That was the bad me talking. To make a long story short, this person showed up at the food bank, discovered that there were all kinds of other volunteers who were known to this person, had a great time, had a wonderful time handing out whatever there was to be handled out, whether it was the frozen proteins or the cans of non-perishable vegetables and fruit or bags of rice and beans and so forth. The simple act of offering food to people who need it, which is something that goes on in the welcome ministries in El Cajon that Father Dave headed up, that go on all over the place. This is almost like the Eucharist. In fact, on the cover of Community is Church's Community, I had a beautiful painting by Father Kuder, who's now dead, a German priest and painter, an artist, which is called The Meal of Sinners. And all it was is a collection of people just like you and me, sitting around two hands which were handing out to them bread and wine. And they brought their own lives, they brought their own sorrows and joys in their faces and in their clothing to that meal. Well, that is what we do every Sunday.
And in a way, it harkens back to the Sermon on the Mount.
Exactly.
Where Jesus had a big picnic.
That's right.
Just a couple more topics. One, you tell a story, and I apologize a little earlier, you were talking about you don't really know a parish until you've done weddings or funerals and things like that. And first of all, you talk about weddings and a lot of them going outside of the church. Mm-hmm. And I would submit and argue that in a way, they are spiritual in their own sense.
Sure they are. Yeah.
Because they are gathering your friends together. And I've done one wedding for a friend, and I took it very serious. Mm-hmm. It's a very serious thing, and it can be very spiritual. But you talk about what I'm going to call the West Side Story funeral.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You want to tell us about that?
This is one of the things that I shared from my experience. This was years ago now, 30 or more years ago. I used to call it the Hatfields and McCoys, but actually the West Side funeral would be just as apt. The local funeral director would oftentimes call me or some of the other local pastors and say, we have a family, they don't have a parish, they don't have a clergy person. Could you help out? And we would always say yes, right? Not just because of the fee, but because everybody deserves who wants to have God and the Word of God and prayers at the saying goodbye to a beloved family member. They want that, they should have that. I didn't know until I showed up at the funeral parlor for what was going to be part one of the funeral, that this was a deeply divided family with two factions in it. I also found that this was a very hard drinking family, so that when I entered the funeral parlor, I didn't just smell the flowers, but I smelled that the dead had already been waked at 9 a.m, if you know what I mean.
Being yes. Irish, I know exactly what you mean.
and so I did 2 identical short memorial services in the funeral home. And then the funeral director had me get into his car and said, now we're going to do the internment at the Veterans Cemetery. He said, but we got to get you out of there before the 2 parts of the family converge on one another. So we went there, had my vestments on still. I did the internment. And he said, well, we're going to have my assistant, say some words to the other group, but please go ahead and do the internment. And I did. And as I was turning away from it, I saw the second part of the family coming down the hill. But I will say that there were a number, at least 4 sheriff's office cars there. So they were able to control these 2 groups. The funeral director did not want the 2 groups to be together, given their state of having awakened the dead.
They have metal detectors?
I don't know if they had metal detectors, but they were afraid of mayhem and inter-family violence starting. And that was my one taste of what can happen that you would never be prepared for in seminary.
Okay. And we talked about how a number of the pastors selected in your book are published, either formally published or like Kathy Caimano, who does a blog, Free Range Priest. And yet, your average parish priest probably has spoken, and if they collected their sermons, which they used to do back in the day, and would put out a book of their sermons, probably has gathered as much writing and as much thinking as these more noted theologians.
Yeah, somewhere along the line, a colleague of mine said about that. The first thing you think about are all of the homilies or sermons that you've preached over the years, and that if all of those manuscripts were put together, you'd have several volumes, and you never thought of yourself even as a writer, as you're saying. But my colleague said, but how many more times have you sat there on the phone or sat there next to somebody and listened? And then after what you had heard, tried to find a word of life, a word of hope, a word of joy for a situation that seemed devoid of all of those kinds of things. Or how many times when somebody asked you to pray with them, did you pray with them? Or how many times when you went to a hospital or a nursing facility, or as I used to do a weekly service in an assisted living facility with people who were sleeping because they had just had lunch. If you put together all of that, all of those words, if you will, you'd have even a vaster library.
And the other thing, we talked about how the book speaks directly to pastors and ministers. But I think also that the book speaks to people who don't have the formal title of pastor, who are themselves ministers to God and spreading the good news, that being every member of the congregation.
Exactly. I think I try to do that with Afanasieff at the beginning, but also I think that if anybody reads what these wonderful pastor theologians have had to say and what their experiences are like, what they'll come away from is that there's plenty of ministry to do. That ministry is not something just for the few people who have the bishop's hands placed on their head before the altar one day in the past, but everyone who has become part of the Christian community has a vocation or a calling to minister, to serve God by serving the brothers and sisters around.
And ultimately, although in Community is Church, Church is Community, and in this book, more so in Community is Church than in this book, there is a recitation of church shrinkage statistics and discussion of nuns and duns. Ultimately, the message that you are conveying is an optimistic message that the spirituality and the work of the church in the community, not for the community, but in the community, with the community is still very relevant today.
Yeah, the church started out small. I'm not necessarily saying that it'll end small, but small isn't bad. Small is terrifying to people who measure the success of a parish, the success of a denomination in terms of how many people show up on a Sunday morning or how many people they can register in the rolls of the church as members, members who contribute and all. The real test of what church is between Monday and Saturday. What are people doing in those times? And I know that most priests that I'm close to keep saying this in their preaching.
By the way, hashtag the other 167, because there is 1 hour in church on Sunday, and there are 167 other hours in the week to go out and be Christian.
That's right. So everything that we're doing in between is an outgrowth of what we're doing in that 1 hour. If we are praising God, thanking God, interceding with God for people who have asked us to pray for them, if we are breaking the bread and we are sharing the cup and sharing the peace, we are going to continue to do that Monday through Saturday. If we are praying for people, we will pray for them by listening to them, by forgiving them, by helping to give out food at a food bank. All the things that we do, we have to see as church. Church is not just that 1 hour or hour and 15 minutes on a Sunday.
Okay, we're getting close to the end. If you had to choose, and they always love to give you these questions to think about. If you had to choose 3 people from your book to have dinner with, who would you choose and why?
I do actually know a couple of the people live and in person in the book, Rowan Williams being one. I've had the opportunity to be not only at several conferences with him, but also to be a guest with my wife when he was Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace, and to have coffee and cakes with his wife, who was.
So are you inviting him back for dinner?
Well, I'd love to. I mean, I've missed him the last couple of times he came to the States, but I still hope to be able to see him live and in person. He is someone who is described to me by his former confessor as someone who after 2 minutes you will feel like you've known all your life, because that's his hospitality, that's his welcome to anybody and everybody. He is, no matter how high-ranking a professor he was, the Lady Margaret professor, he is a parish priest. He is Father Rowan, even though he's Archbishop.
So who else is getting invited to dinner?
Well, the other one is that I've never met her. I've corresponded with her, would be Barbara Brown Taylor, because of her amazing sense of humor. She was able to laugh at herself after having really gone way overboard, gone kind of workaholic as a priest, made a fool of herself. She was able to, I should say, recover from that and gain new perspective of it and move from that into being a professor of comparative religion. Someone who, like me, both was in church at the altar and the pulpit, but also in the classroom.
Okay, you get one more.
Yeah, one more. This is very hard, very, very hard to do, but I think that Nadia Bolz-Weber is someone who, would be immediately controversial just by the way she looks.
She would
and the way
spark
she
conversation.
Talks. But I think what you find when you listen to her is that there is a heart there that knows its relationship to God and knows that it's completely dependent. I'm completely dependent upon God. And that means that I totally am dependent upon you as a sister or a brother. But saying that, I think all the rest of them would be people I'd want to sit and swill coffee with too. Yeah.
All right. A question that I have to ask, because somebody that I know well requests that I ask this question regularly. What is your favorite of Luther's 95 Theses?
I think you've asked me that before, and having served in the Lutheran Church, I will say that the start of it, is a quotation really from the beginning of the Gospel of Mark or Matthew, where Jesus says, turn yourself around. The usual translation is repent. But that means turn yourself inside out, turn yourself upside down, be transformed. If you want to understand all the rest of the gospel or the good news that Jesus came to bring, it's that. And the other thing that Luther said is that he didn't just mean it for that day, he meant it forever.
Okay. Michael, when does the book come out?
I believe I checked this morning just to make sure, and now they're saying May of 2024.
Okay, so it should be on your Amazon Prime account very shortly. Maybe we can convince him to do a book review group online. Might be interesting. Otherwise, thank you for the talk. Thank you for being a friend.
questions.
And that's it.